Star Wars movies have always had a modern political context behind them, informing the choices made in their development, and in some cases taking the shape of overt references to issues of the day, albeit reskinned into a galaxy far, far away. I've already covered how this informed the development of, and expressed itself in, The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, and today we're going to look at how that worked in the final movie of the prequels, Revenge of the Sith. While Attack of the Clones came out after the American election of 2000, 9/11, and the beginnings of the War on Terror, it had been written before any of those events, meaning their impact was less felt in Attack of the Clones, but with Revenge of the Sith, all of these things would factor into the movie's development. The 2003 invasion of Iraq preceded the principal photography of Revenge of the Sith, which occurred between June and September of 2003, but it was after the script was written. But while all of those things will play into what we're talking about today, it's also important to remember how foundational George Lucas's view of the Vietnam War, Watergate, and American President Richard Nixon were to how he viewed these contemporary events. In a lot of ways, the prequels as a whole were basically a commentary on those contemporary events, so in the case of Revenge of the Sith, 9/11, the War on Terror, and the Bush administration, but essentially interpreted through Lucas's feelings about Vietnam, Watergate, and Nixon. Fundamentally, Star Wars in the prequel trilogy reflects George's idea that democracies will be given away by the people living within it. Specifically, so far in the prequels, he'd been showing them as corrupted by corporate interests. But basically, the idea is that throughout history, there has been, is, and will be a cycle of figures like Palpatine trying to take advantage of various situations to turn democracy into a dictatorship. And this is done not despite, but at the urging of the people who live within that democracy. The extra powers taken by Palpatine in the movies are intended to mirror things like George's repeated claims that Richard Nixon wanted to amend the Constitution to allow himself to stay in power, which in the modern context, or at least modern at the time of Revenge of the Sith, became a comparison for things like the Patriot Act, which included expansion of surveillance powers by the government and other restrictions of liberties in the wake of 9/11. One thing to remember is that whether you agree with Lucas's conclusions or premises on any of these issues, when we're dealing with how political issues impacted the movies, it's important to start from the position of how Lucas himself saw them. For example, despite how important Lucas mentions the third Nixon term as being in a lot of the ideas that informed the prequels, the question of repealing the 22nd Amendment, which limits presidents to 2 terms, was not unique to Nixon. These term limits were still relatively new, and as Peabody and Grant discuss in their article The Twice and Future President, direct criticism of the 22nd Amendment from presidents themselves came more heavily from Truman and Eisenhower right after it was enacted. Pushing for its repeal under Nixon primarily came from other supporter groups very briefly in his second term before Watergate made that a complete non-starter. But for Lucas, his opposition to Nixon and the Vietnam War more generally informs how he looked at other political issues going forward. Because again, George himself repeatedly talks about this as a historical cycle, so Nixon wasn't this aberration, it basically becomes a mental framework that he's using to judge the events going on around the prequels as well. One of the 2 major lines in the movie which people gravitate towards when discussing its politics is when Anakin says,
"If you're not with me, then you're my enemy."
This is something which is very much in the political discourse of the United States at the time in the wake of 9/11, and it's something that very closely mirrors quotes given by American political leaders. Hillary Clinton, who was then a Democratic New York senator, said some variation of nations either being with the states or with the terrorists shortly after 9/11, which was followed up quickly by President George W. Bush saying, quote, "Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists," end quote. But even though this had started as a basically bipartisan idea, complaints about the film tended to come from conservatives who saw Anakin's line as an attack on Bush's leadership, especially as the film had come out several years after a lot of this early support from Democrats for a lot of the actions taken by the Bush administration had significantly waned. But we'll get back to some of that bipartisan support and how it impacted Revenge of the Sith soon. Rick McCallum, producer throughout the prequels, called conservative complaints that the prequels criticized Bush such shit, I promise you. I know there's one line, you're either with me or you're against me, that echoes something, but that was actually in the script way before it had even become a nightmare that it was possible that Bush could become president. That line has been echoed since the beginning of time. He says instead that Lucas's concern was with Nixon in Vietnam. But I think this goes back to positioning Nixon as a unique evil in Lucas's eyes and ignores Nixon being more emblematic of the cycle of democracies being handed away, which Lucas definitely saw as a connection with Bush and the War on Terror, even if Nixon was what prompted his original interest in it and had made him think about using it as a storyline in the prequels to begin with. When presenting Revenge of the Sith at the Cannes Film Festival, George himself said, quote, "The parallels between what we did in Vietnam and what we're doing in Iraq now are unbelievable," end quote. So while yes, Vietnam and Nixon remained the prime movers of George's political constellation, those parallels being something George was commenting on was probably not in fact such shit, and instead fed into George's belief in the cycle that leads to democracy being given away. And this is certainly something which audiences noted as having strong parallels to the political rhetoric which existed around them all the time. This extended to the rhetoric about security in the movie, which was originally a bit more on the nose than it was in the final draft, like a lot of what we talked about in Attack of the Clones. An earlier draft of the scene where Palpatine appoints Anakin to the Council involved a discussion between the two on the need to endure constitutional amendments in the name of security, again mirroring discussions around the increasing security apparatus at the time, a specific theme which was a lot more present in Revenge of the Sith than in Attack of the Clones or The Phantom Menace, again indicating how the discourse in wider society might have influenced what George was exposed to and how these themes were expressed in the movie. It's not that this was a complete non-factor before, this is something that came up a bit with Padme security in Episode 2, but I think it's hard to look at Revenge of the Sith, whether the final product or the earlier drafts, and not see these specific expressions being influenced by how they were discussed in the wider political context. The way terrorism and national security were discussed, especially in the United States, but also internationally, were very different after 9/11 than before. And I think the way Padme's security in Episode 2 is talked about versus the way the Republic's security in Episode 3 reflects that difference. The second line is, of course, Padme's,
"So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause."
Which again highlights the through line George always says he's pointing to with Star Wars and that we keep going back to in these videos. Democracy is gladly given away by the people refusing to like this video and subscribe for more. I think looking at how the focus of each prequel shifts in how it displays this to mirror issues as they developed in the world when the movies were written helps underline the impacts those things had on the movie's production, and how George saw each issue fitting into this cycle. The flavor of how Palpatine was gaining power in Episode 1 emphasized problems with deregulation and the fecklessness of a beleaguered president beset by scandal, which matched his views of Bill Clinton and the aims of the Republicans in the '94 midterms. The focus on business and corporate exploitation maintained more through Attack of the Clones, especially in the cutscenes, and then with Revenge of the Sith, a greater emphasis was placed on the state security apparatus, while critiques of the corporate lobbying fell by the wayside. Even the final cut of Attack of the Clones, which was made after the events of 9/11 and the start of the War on Terror, tended to de-emphasize a lot of the scenes, really explaining what the CIS was going for with all the corporate exploitation, like the one with Dooku and Amidala. Instead, keeping just the focus on the security elements, which would get even more focus in Revenge of the Sith. It kind of represents a shift in who Lucas was focusing on as being responsible for giving away democracy. As noted with the "with us or against us" quotes, the sentiments in favor of the war and emergency powers came not just from Bush and the Republicans, but also from Democrats like Clinton, especially early on. Support was both widespread and bipartisan. The Patriot Act, despite becoming controversial after the fact, was passed a month after the September 11th attacks, with 83% of the House of Representatives voting for it, including almost every Republican and 69% of Democrats, and in the Senate, 98 senators voted for it out of a total of 100. The 2001 Authorization of Military Force Joint Resolution, which gave the President authority to act without congressional approval against any group suspected to have been involved in the planning or execution of September 11th, was passed in the House with 420 votes for and only 1 against, and made it through the Senate with 98 votes for and none against, despite misgivings even at the time about how broadly these powers could be applied. This is what was used for the invasion of Afghanistan, although not Iraq, which was a separate vote in 2002 before the 2003 invasion. For those who oppose the wars, this level of bipartisan support in the government for the Patriot Act, as well as the Afghanistan and then Iraq war, which was less supported by elected Democrats but still pretty heavily supported, was very much an example of what Padme was talking about with liberty dying to thunderous applause. There's another set of cutscenes focusing on Padme and the delegation of 2000, a group of senators who are opposed to the war and want to stop the power that Palpatine is gathering around him. The emphasis in these scenes is very much on these senators being loyal to the Republic, not loyal to the Separatists, in the same way that people who dissented against the War on Terror or the earlier Vietnam War were often labeled as terrorist sympathizers or communists. The symbolism of a post-9/11 America has some other expressions in the movie as well. Scott Mendelson in Forbes makes note of the, quote, imagery during the film's carnage-filled final half, most notably a Jedi temple burning to the ground as meant to evoke 9/11, end quote. The intentionality of having shots of the Jedi Temple evoke 9/11 has long been discussed on fan forums, with some claiming Lucasfilm reps confirmed this was the intent, but I've never been able to find that. Again though, I think this is somewhere where, regardless of whether it was a directly intentional move, it's certainly a parallel which fed into the discussion around the movie's political context at the time. Lucas, to a smaller degree, and Rick McCallum, to a larger degree, often tried to downplay the idea of contemporary references in the prequels, instead talking about how they turned out to be eerily prescient, saying in the Chicago Tribune in 2005, quote, "First of all, we never thought of Bush ever becoming president, or then 9/11, the Patriot Act, war, weapons of mass destruction. Then suddenly you realize, oh my god, there's something happening that looks like we're almost prescient. And then we thought, well yeah, but he'll never make it to a second term, so it'll look like we made some wacky political parody of a guy that everyone's forgotten," end quote. But again, while McCallum keeps referring to these movies as being written before even Bush's election, that doesn't seem to match the production timelines we do know of, especially knowing how many revisions the scripts got even shortly before principal photography, which was much later. It's hard to take the claim seriously that there was absolutely no impact of modern politics, and that it was solely about an abstract cycle, or still just a reaction to Vietnam, when the focus of the film shifts to match important political issues going on during the conventionally known writing and production windows for the movies. This is why I think it makes sense to reconcile that by looking at the prequels in the context of Lucas's statements about all of this being one more expression in a historical cycle, which to Lucas always comes through the lens of Nixon and Vietnam. It's hard to give credit for talking about being surprisingly prescient when in every single case, they're talking about predicting events which happened shortly before or during the writing of the proper movie scripts and production of the movie rather than after. There was certainly already the premise of Palpatine gaining power by being voluntarily given it for sure, but going through the specifics in each movie up to and including Revenge of the Sith, I think it's hard to ignore the contemporary skin on the way those issues played out and the way that impacted where the focus was in each movie. That's going to do it for our look at the political context of Revenge of the Sith. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this series, which I'm sure I'll continue with other bits of Star Wars media in the future. I think another interesting one would be some of the books released around Revenge of the Sith, like Labyrinth of Evil and even the Revenge of the Sith novelization, which played a lot more openly into Iraq War parallels. Special thanks to the patrons showing up on screen now, as well as the channel members whose support makes the channel possible. Remember to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to get alerts for future videos, and I hope to see you next time.